Scott mentioned, I now serve as the president of Gordon College in Boston, and it's a great privilege to be able to be here with you tonight. I'm going to be able to share with you some work that I spent 10 years of my life doing. This actually started as my dissertation at Princeton, and so I'm living proof that you can write a dissertation that your wife will describe as actually interesting. And originally, I was trying to do 40 face-to-face interviews with senior leaders in American public life who were evangelical Christians. So I thought if I could do 40 interviews with some senior people who were in government or business or nonprofit life, that would be a really fun dissertation. I'd really enjoy it. My goal was to try and reach a very high level of leaders. I was serving as a teaching assistant for an undergraduate class at Princeton called Elites, Leadership, and Society. It was taught by a woman named Suzanne Keller, and she was a legend on campus. She was the first woman to get tenure at Princeton University. And when it occurred, it was on the front page of the New York Times. And she had taught this class for literally like 35 years. And she said, Michael, the students who take this class, they either run the world already or they soon will. And so it's important that we sort of think deliberately about the kind of material that we expose them to and the kind of discussions that we have. So for the entire summer before I taught the class, I would be reading the material that the students were going to read, and then she and I would meet every other week or so for coffee to talk about the material. And it was sort of my introduction to the subject of power and leadership from a social scientific perspective. At the end of that summer, I said to her, Suzanne, we've done all of these interesting studies about, the political lives of public leaders and their family backgrounds and their educational experiences, but we've not looked at any work that deals with their religious lives. And I think that that's something, I'm curious, what do you read in this? And she said, well, I don't think anybody's written about that. And I said, well, why not? And she said, well, because they're not religious. And I said, well, I don't believe that. I think there are a lot of people of faith who are in positions of power. And she said, now, if you could prove that, that would be a book worth reading. So that's what I thought I'd write my dissertation on. And originally, I was just trying to do 40 interviews, but I wanted to reach really high folks. So I started trying to see, who's the highest ranking person I could start with, and that would sort of lay the framework for the study. So I called in every personal favor from family members and friends to see who I could get connected with. A guy I had gone to college with, his father was friends with Jimmy Carter in Atlanta. So I called and said, could you help me get an interview with President Carter? And this is really early in the study. And he said, well, I don't think so, but, send me the stuff and we'll see if we can do it. Well, sure enough, that worked. So I got the interview with Jimmy Carter. And then I had somebody else in Houston who had a family relationship with James Baker. James Baker had served as Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of State. He had been White House Chief of Staff for 2 different presidents, and he had also led 5 successful presidential campaigns. So very, very senior Republican. And miraculously, somebody got that connection for me, so I got an interview with him. And then a third person was Michael Duke, the CEO of Walmart. And I got that because I met his daughter at a conference, and we ended up sharing a cab to go back to the airport, and we exchanged, email addresses and just sort of stayed in touch. So I called her and said, can you give me an interview with your dad? After I had those 3 interviews, then I just dropped their names left and right and to say, could I get some interviews with more folks? And sure enough, it worked. And so I got these 40 interviews, and I go to talk to my dissertation committee, and they said, this is amazing. You've got some really high-level people. Is there anybody else that's agreed to be in this study, but you didn't get a chance to interview? And so I gave them some names. I said, yeah, actually, I've got this person, and various folks who had agreed to be in the study. And they said, oh, this is too significant. You need to go back out in the field and do some more interviews. So they sent me on my way. I spent another 6 months doing interviews, and I completed 100 interviews. And that's a lot for a dissertation. And so I come to meet with my committee, and I'm really excited because I'm now ready. I've got the data. I'm ready to analyze it. Here we go. And at the end of this, so they were sort of guiding me. At the end of the meeting, they said, is there anybody else who's agreed to be in the study? And I said, yeah, there are a few people. And they said, like who? So I mentioned a few other folks, and they said, oh, no, you've got to get those interviews. Go back out into the field, and we'll help you get some grant dollars to do it. And so I did another 100 interviews. So 200 interviews. That's a lot. So I go to the meeting. I start the meeting and say, yes, there are other people who have agreed to be in the study. Here are their names, but I'm really ready to write my dissertation. And my advisor said, Michael, you got to keep going. This is too good. So I went back out in the field. So I continued to do interviews. I finished my dissertation. I get a faculty job teaching at Rice. My first semester, my wife and I are invited to have dinner with the president and his wife, and we're just having some conversation. He had been the dean at Columbia Law School before he came to be the president at Rice. And as it turned out, the largest interview-based study of senior leaders that's ever been done was conducted at Columbia University in 1970, something called the American Leadership Study. And for that project, they had interviewed 545 senior leaders. So we're sort of talking, and he said, yeah, I'm interested in the research. And I said, the interesting thing about my work is that I've written this book about faith and power, but I have all this other stuff about leadership that I could do something with. I'd love to do it someday. And he said, how many interviews did you do? And I said, at this point, I'd done about 350 interviews. And I said, actually, ironically, there was another study that was done at Columbia, and I told him about this American Leadership Study. And he said, so are you saying that if you did another 200 interviews, it would be the largest study that ever been done? And I said, yeah, I guess so. But I said, that's very expensive, and I'm now a faculty member. I'm done doing my data collection. I'm just going to write my book. And he said, no, I really think you ought to go back out into the field and see if you could do something. And so that became my life calling. And so I was trying to do these, and it's really hard to do the data collection, because I had to be the person to do the interviews, and they were all over. And I've been working on it for several years. So my goal was to do 550 interviews. Then, after I'd been at Rice for 4 years, I had the opportunity to apply for the presidency at Gordon, and I really did not think I thought that was a very long stretch, and I was not the right person. I thought it was going to be just an interesting experience to go through. But in the process of that, the Lord really called my wife and I to Gordon. And I remember I got into bed one night in January. This was January of 2011. And I said to my wife, Rebecca, I have been working on this study of these interviews for like 8 years of our life. And my goal has always been to do 550 interviews, but I've got 90 to go to get to that level. And I'm just not sure I think this Gordon thing may work out. And if it worked out, there's no way I could keep doing interviews. I could not keep doing my data collection. And I'm not really sure, how I'm going to finish this. I'll never forget this. Rebecca sits up in bed. She turns to me. She says, well, you're gonna. We've been working on this for 8 years, and it's coming to a close. And so that semester, my last semester teaching at Rice, I was teaching Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I taught a class at 9, 10, and 2. And I would teach my class on Monday, and then after my 2 o'clock class, I would race to the airport, and I'd catch a flight to a big city like New York. And I'd get there late on Monday night. I'd wake up the next morning. I'd do my first interview at 7 o'clock in the morning, and I would stack the interviews so that I could try and do 4 or 5 interviews in a day. Now, I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but for social scientists, that's a big, big deal. Normally, you would do like 1 or 2 interviews a day, and I'd do 5. Then I'd do my last interview to conclude at 6 o'clock so I could race to LaGuardia, catch the last flight back to Houston, get into Houston like at midnight, go to bed, wake up the next morning, teach my class at 9, 10, and 2. Then I'd go back to the airport and I'd fly to another city, do the same thing again on Thursday, fly back into Houston, teach my class 9, 10, and 2. And then on Saturday, I would try and do all of the analysis that I needed to do the next round of interviews. I ended up basically completing it very close to the end of my time at Rice. I had one last interview to do, and I decided to save it for Drew Faust, the president of Harvard. So she was my final interview, and ended up doing 550 face-to-face interviews, and View from the Top as a result of that study. So tonight, I thought that I would just share with you some of the things that I learned while working on that. It actually took a decade of my life, and I got a chance to meet some amazing people. So senior leaders in American public life, like cabinet secretaries, heads of federal bureaus and agencies, as well as former Presidents Carter and Bush. It included leaders from every single White House administration, going back to President Johnson to President Obama. So it covered a very, very wide spectrum of time. It also included a variety of leaders in business, so 250 CEOs of American companies, including 20 of the Fortune 100 CEOs. So head of Walmart, head of Goldman Sachs, head of Citigroup, all of the major oil companies, Walmart. It was a really fun project. If there's one big conclusion that I walked away from the study, it is that there's two things that you have to do when you're going to lead really effectively. You have to think institutionally, which is a concept I picked up from a guy named Hugh Hecklow, a political scientist who's written on that topic, but act personally. You have to be able to keep the sort of strategic kind of level work that you do at the institution level, but also keep the heart of what it means to be connected to a group of followers. Leadership is fundamentally about having followers and acting personally in their life. Tonight I want to share with you a few stories of some folks who I thought were pretty extraordinary. One of them is this guy, Horst Schulze. He taught me a lot about building organizational culture. Horst is a very unlikely CEO. He grew up in Germany, and he didn't go to college or university. He went to trade school to learn the trade of becoming a manager of a luxury hotel. And at the end of his schooling, he was given the assignment of writing a manifesto for the hospitality industry. And he said, I didn't even know what a manifesto was at the time. But it was basically, what's his philosophy behind hospitality and how would he make it work? He would have to walk to school, and he said, so that gave me a lot of time to begin thinking about what would be this equivalent of a thesis project that he was working on. He was really active at church, and his pastor preached a sermon one Sunday about the imago Dei, the theological idea of how we're made in the image of God from Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And as he walked, he began to realize that some of the things that he was learning in his trade school actually was at odds with that theological concept. Because he realized that one of the premises of luxury hotels in the 1970s, as he was going through this, was that many times the staff were taught to be so unobtrusive that they sort of receded into the background. And in the process, they actually began to see themselves as second-class citizens. For example, doormen were taught that when they opened the door, they were supposed to open the door in such a way so that their bodies would be located sort of pinned behind the door so as to never obstruct the walkway for their guests. But it meant that the guests never actually saw the doorman's face as they were holding the door open for them. Housekeepers were taught that when they saw guests in the hallway, they were to sort of look down so as to not intrude their personal space. But in the process of that, the housekeepers never made a personal connection with the people that they were serving. And he said, I realized that I was uncomfortable with this because we were actually not seeing ourselves as having equal merit or worth. And it had a profound impact on the psyche of these folks who were working at these hotels. So he decided he was going to come up with a phrase that would sort of help to shape his understanding of what the hospitality industry should be. He said, we really need to see ourselves as ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen. That we actually have equal dignity and worth, even though we are serving the folks who happen to be our guests. And he said, if we could get this right, we could deal with the high turnover rate that we have within hotels and the hospitality industry. And we could instill the sense of self-esteem and purpose that actually would cause our employees to actually serve their customers in a much more profound way. He held on to that paper for many years. He ended up immigrating to the United States, where he became a senior executive working at Hyatt Hotels and Resorts based in Chicago. In the early 1980s, a group of investors came to him because he had made a name for himself within the business. And they said, we would like to start a new hotel chain, and we think you're the kind of person to help us build the organizational culture. He said, I'd love to do it, but I have a particular vision in mind, and I want to be given some degrees of freedom to be able to pull that out. They said, listen, if you make the financial metrics, you can build the culture however you want. So he pulled out that manifesto he'd written as a young man, and he said, this is what we're going to do to build our organizational culture. And that actually became part of the mantra of this new institution. It ended up working very well. As he predicted, employees began to see themselves as having more ability and talent. They engaged with their customers in a more profound way. Employee turnover was the lowest within the industry. Customer service scores were at the very top of the industry. They became the darling of the hotel business for many years, and in fact, they won the Malcolm Baldrige Award not once but twice, the annual award that's given by the Department of Commerce, which is seen as sort of the gold medal in a particular industry. He said, when you win the Malcolm Baldrige Award the first time, your competitors send you flowers and say congratulations. When you win it a second time, they say, what's your secret sauce? And he said they would all fly to come meet with us and to figure out what was it that things were really different. And I'd call them into my office and I'd say, you know what? You got to get your theology straight. And he used it as a chance to talk about the doctrine of the Imago Dei and how being made in the image of God, a faith-filled concept, actually transformed their business. Now, it's interesting because Horst Schulze led this company for many, many years, but he actually retired from the company in 2006, a decade ago. But one of the things is that when you think institutionally, you recognize that the impact you have lasts a lot longer than when you happen to be in the seat where you're exercising leadership. I stayed at one of these hotels earlier this year. On the last night of my stay, I got a note underneath the door. It wasn't a bill, it was a thank you note. They came from the general manager thanking me for being there and saying, we're really grateful to have you here. And it was signed, the ladies and gentlemen of Ritz-Carlton Hotels and Resorts. This is actually the mantra of Ritz-Carlton. And it's been in place since it was started. It's a theological concept that gets woven into the organizational culture of a very secular company. And because the leader was so effective, he was able to build it into the DNA of the institution that lasts a decade after he's already retired from the company. Amazing example of thinking institutionally in a way that brings your faith to bear in a very profound way. When I went to go interview President Carter at the Carter Center in Atlanta, I spent a week of my life in the archives of the Presidential Library, just trying to make sure I covered as much ground as possible. And I was really intrigued to see what I think is probably the most significant public policy achievement of his presidency, the Camp David Accords. This is, as you know, the peace that he helped broker between Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel, and Anwar Sadat, the President of Egypt. To this day, it's the most lasting peace that Israel has ever known with one of its Arab neighbors. But I did not know that Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat never saw each other at Camp David until they actually were signing the agreement. Jimmy Carter said, I kept them apart from each other because I didn't want that to interfere with actually trying to bring about world peace. But the interesting thing about it is that there were many moments when the Camp David Accords almost fell apart. One time, Menachem Begin walked out of the negotiating room and President Carter and his staff were very disappointed and they thought this is the end. His staff went to go try and see if they could talk to their Israeli counterparts, and President Carter said, no, let me go. He goes out onto this porch area at one of the buildings at Camp David, puts his arm around Menachem Begin. He said, Menachem, I've taught Sunday school at my Baptist church in Plains, Georgia for many, many years. We Christians have so much to thank from the Jewish community, from the Jewish heritage, and from the Jewish faith that has informed our concepts that have been really helpful. But there is one concept that I think the Jews understand better than the Christians. And it is this concept of shalom. Shalom is not about the ending or the ceasing of conflict or strife. It's about a state of life, a degree of settledness where you can actually lead to the flourishing, to the growth, to the well-being of a community. It's this concept that the prophet Jeremiah says in chapter 29, you've been carried to this city to seek the peace and prosperity of this place. It is this sense of shalom, which actually is sort of like an organic metaphor, will allow things to grow and thrive and develop. President Carter said, don't you think, Menachem, it would be a great gift for your granddaughter to know and to cherish shalom with one of her Arab neighbors? We have that chance here today. Let's not give it up. That was the turning point of the Camp David Accords. A moment when a leader was willing to bring his own Christian faith to bear on a particular situation, to act very personally and directly intervene. because he was the person in the room where the decision was made, he was able to act in a very personal way, but it actually changed the course of human history. To this day, Israel benefits from that sense of shalom with Egypt. It's an amazing example of how a leader can bring their faith to bear in a very profound way. One of the big lessons that I picked up from View from the Top is that every single leader faces some kind of crisis. You know, we look at the lives of people who we read about, and you just assume that everything is a really, what I would call an up and to the right kind of life. The graph is always going up and to the right, and everything is really good. When in fact, every single person I interviewed, all 550 people, were able to cite a very real and profound crisis that they experienced in their life, where the outcome was not predicted and where they didn't know exactly what would happen. We're told throughout Scripture, including in the book of James, that we will endure various trials. The key thing that I found makes a difference is how we respond to the challenges that God allows into our life. The idea that we're going to sort of be able to avoid those challenges, I don't think that's a reality. But I do believe that the Lord can provide us the resources we need to be steadfast in the midst of those. I interviewed so many extraordinary people in this space who have faced different crises. But one person who really impressed me is this guy, Barry Rowan. Barry's been one of the leaders in the telecommunications business for decades. One time he was the number 2 guy at Vonage. But the story really relates to a venture that he started down in Brazil. Barry said that in the early 2000s, Brazil was the 8th most populous country in the world. But in terms of teledensity, that is, the number of people who had access to mobile phones, they were actually 55th in the world. So 8th most populous, but 55th in teledensity. He said, that's a great business opportunity. So he built this business to go down to Brazil, and he said the first 6 months, we were just taking off like gangbusters. It was amazing. People were signing up for our mobile phones, and it was a great, exciting, heady time to be there. And he said, as a Christian, I felt like we were doing such good work because we would hear these stories about families who were connecting for the first time on the telephone. They never experienced it. We heard stories about grandmothers whose lives were saved because by making a call on a cell phone, they were able to get the grandmother to the hospital when she had a heart attack in time so she didn't die. Stories of pregnant mothers who were able to deliver their baby. People who were able to connect with lost loved ones they had never been able to connect with. But because they had a cell phone, they now could do it. It was amazing stories. And he said, I felt like we were right in the place where God would have us to be. After a period of time, though, he said, we began to have a business problem. And that was the Brazilians were not paying their bills. He said, they thought that we were a state-owned utility, that we were like the telephone company or the gas company or the water company, which was all owned by the Brazilian government. And he said, there's a culture in Brazil that, if you get a bill from the government, you don't actually have to pay it. And so he said, people began to delay paying their bills. 3 months, 6 months, 9 months without paying their bills. And he said, we're a business and we got to have people pay the bill in order for us to keep growing and developing. And he said, this became to be very difficult for us. And after about a year of this, he said, I realized we cannot make this business model work. 6 months we go in and the company's going like gangbusters. Everybody's signing up and Jesus is saying good work because you saved the grandmother's life and the baby was delivered and everything feels great. And then a year later, we're on the brink of bankruptcy. And I'm pleading with God to keep this alive because we feel like we're doing such good work. And he said, the job of the leader is to absorb the chaos in the system and to radiate out hope. And I felt like I was being given this responsibility to somehow communicate hope when actually I didn't know what we were going to do. And then he said, we eventually reached the conclusion the business cannot sustain this. And so we were going to have to make cuts. And so some of the very people I recruited to come down with me from the States to start this business, I'm actually now having to say, we can't continue to do this. He said, the real challenge is how do you keep institutional hope alive when the institution begins to fail. So much of the challenges that we encounter is how we respond in the midst of these challenges when we don't know the answers. You know, the tough thing about leading is that you have to live life going forward, but you only understand it looking backward. And so a lot of times you don't actually know what's really happening or how this is going to resolve itself. And Barry said, I learned in that situation that actually I had to try and keep hope alive, even as I pointed to the reality that our hope is not based in the business success of our company. Very important lesson that he was able to provide in a very critical moment. One of the most intimidating interviews that I conducted was with Condoleezza Rice. Now, this is a woman who is incredibly polished, unbelievably bright, funny, articulate. I mean, she can talk football and nuclear disarmament in the same paragraph. Very, very talented woman. I met her at her office at Stanford. And in the course of the interview, I asked her, what was the most poignant moment of your time in Washington? Now, I thought she was going to talk about 9/11 because that was a very significant moment in our country's history, and she was serving as a national security advisor. Or I thought she might talk about the day she was sworn in as Secretary of State. I knew that she'd had an amazing career and experience, but one that she had not quite expected. If you know her story, as a teenager, she thought she would be a concert pianist, very, very talented musician. But she goes to the Van Cliburn competition, and she realized in that moment that she worked on a particular piece for an entire year, and somebody else played the exact same piece, but he had only worked on it for about a week. And she said, I just realized I'm never going to be as talented as that guy, and I need to find a new passion. She ended up enrolling at the University of Denver and took a class from a man named Professor Corbell, who had immigrated to the United States from Eastern Europe, and he was a real expert on the Soviet Union. She developed a real passion for the Soviet Union, and he persuaded her to eventually go on and pursue a PhD, which she did at Notre Dame, and to get a commitment to not just academia, but also public service. Professor Corbell is an extraordinary man because he had influence not just on Condoleezza Rice, but also on his daughter, who so happens to be Madeleine Albright. Only man alive who's had influence on the two, female secretaries of state before Hillary Clinton. Really extraordinary story. But she said, I think probably my most poignant time in Washington occurred probably in June of 2002. And she's saying that I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, what in the world happened in June of 2002? I can't think of anything that was really big or significant. And I said, I'm so sorry, Dr. Rice. Can you give me some more context? What was occurring? And she said, well, there's something that happens in the Oval Office called the Principals Meeting. And it's a group of about 15 people who gather, who are some of the president's senior advisors. She said, I was there as National Security Advisor, but the Secretary of State is there, the Secretary of Defense is there, the Attorney General, the White House Chief of Staff, the Vice President. A number of key people are there. And this particular afternoon, there had been a proposal that had been circulating around the White House for about 3 months, put together by Mike Gerson and Josh Bolten, to really advance the president's agenda around compassionate conservatism. You may remember that was one of the hallmarks of George W. Bush's presidency, or he said in the campaign he wanted to sort of articulate a public policy that would advance compassionate conservatism. At the time, a couple of these folks had put together a proposal to try and address the AIDS pandemic in sub-Saharan Africa. In the late 1990s, AIDS was ravaging sub-Saharan Africa. And the real challenge is that it was creating an entire continent of orphans. Mothers and fathers were dying by the tens of thousands on a daily basis. And in the process of that, entire generations of young people were suddenly without parents. And it was creating tremendous social problems, health problems, economic problems across many countries in Africa. So the idea was that maybe the U.S. government could, through foreign aid, provide the kind of medicines that would allow these parents to take advantage of the same benefits that people in the United States had. There's no cure for HIV. All we can do is extend life. Through a cocktail of drugs, people can take that and it will extend their life for probably 10 to 15 years. And so the proposal was a very big gamble to say we ought to allocate $15 billion of U.S. foreign aid to try and address the AIDS pandemic in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, for a Republican president to expand foreign aid by $15 billion, which happens to be the largest expenditure of U.S. foreign aid in American history, it's bigger than the Marshall Plan. And to be able to do that in an era where you've got a president who says he doesn't want a bigger government, that was a radical idea. So they were debating it for a long time, and it finally reached the principals meeting there in the Oval Office. The president was seated here, and they were all arranged in a circle, and as it turned out, Condoleezza Rice was seated beside the president, sort of at the other end. The president went around the circle and asked people to sort of weigh in. Did they think this is a good idea or a bad idea? By the time the circle got to Condoleezza Rice, she said the room was divided in half. Some people had said that they thought it was too big of an expenditure. We weren't sure that the African countries would have the infrastructure to make sure the medicines reached the people on time. There wasn't necessarily the daily discipline of taking vitamins or drugs, so we were worried that people wouldn't actually do it. So we're going to spend all this money and it doesn't actually save lives. And also the reality is that it's not saving anybody's life, it's just extending it for maybe 10 or 15 years. But on the other hand, it is extending the life of mothers and fathers across the entire continent and could make a really big difference in the lives of these kids. The circle came to Condoleezza Rice and she said, Mr. President, I'm very sympathetic and understand both sides of these issues. But if I could, I'd like to just share a personal perspective. She said, when I was 14 years old, my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer. We were living in Birmingham, Alabama at the time. This is a picture of Condoleezza Rice with her mom. Her dad was a Presbyterian minister, and because of that, they had some connections in the medical community in Birmingham. When her mom was diagnosed with breast cancer, she was able to get involved in an experimental drug treatment. At the time, they didn't know if it would eradicate the cancer or what would be the net result. But as it turned out, it extended Condoleezza Rice's mother's life by 15 years. During those 15 years, she saw her daughter graduate from high school early and go to study at the University of Denver. She saw her develop this mentoring relationship with Professor Corbell, who ended up turning her on to the study of the Soviet Union. Condoleezza Rice enrolled in the doctoral program at Notre Dame, had a fellowship to go and learn the Russian language in Moscow, defend her dissertation, and land a tenure-track teaching job at no less than Stanford University. All the while, Condoleezza Rice grew up from a young girl into a woman who had some leadership opportunities. Condoleezza Rice said, I would give everything for those 15 years because it changed my life. It made me who I am today. And then she turned to the president. She said, Mr. President, if it is within the power of the people in this room to give an entire continent of children an extra 15 years with their parents, if today we have the chance to do that and we do not do that, I think history will judge this as our greatest moral failure. And with that, the room turned silent. She said the president was clearly thinking about what she had said and the comments that had gone around the room. And the president was quiet, she said, for a long time. She said it was probably 45 seconds or maybe a minute. But she said, when you're in the Oval Office and you're silent, she said, that is an eternity. We were all waiting to see what happened. The president turned to Condoleezza Rice and then turned to the group and he said, well, I guess we know what we have to do. That was the day that the president launched what became known as PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Relief Plan for Sub-Saharan Africa, AIDS relief. Democrats and Republicans alike would say that PEPFAR is single-handedly the most important public policy achievement of George W. Bush's 8 years in the White House. Still to this day, I was in Zambia a couple of months ago. People still to this day talk about how PEPFAR changed the country dramatically. It has had a tremendous impact on Africa, economic development, opportunities that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. And it really occurred because of a decision that was made in a room of 15 people, where a woman was willing to share her personal story and how that particular opportunity of her mom getting medical treatment kept hope alive. And in the process, it changed the fate of an entire continent. Angela Duckworth is a social psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania. A few months ago, she released a book entitled Grit. I think it's a wonderful book. It talks about how you have to be able to be resilient in the midst of challenges. And one of the key things that she finds is that grit is not about sort of a white-knuckled steeliness which says, I'm not going to ever give up. It is a larger sense of calling and hopeful expectation that something better is coming if I can delay the gratification or push through the challenge I'm facing right now. There's something much bigger that's coming. That's actually what hope is about. That's really what we're trying to do, is to say there's something that's coming that's bigger, that's better. And so it requires a resolve. It requires, if we can speak just in spiritual terms, a degree of faithfulness. That's what we're trying to instill in leaders. Colleen Barrett is a very unusual CEO. She's a chain smoker who never went to college. She's a paralegal who happened to be looking for a job, desperate for a job as a single mom in the late 1960s. She was living in San Antonio, and she decided to go work for a chain-smoking, hard-drinking, cursed-like-a-sailor lawyer guy in San Antonio who had developed a very salty reputation. Secretaries didn't like to work for him because he would yell at them, and he was very, very demanding. His name was Herb. And she went to go work for him, and she said, I didn't really connect with him early on, but I could tell I could learn from him. And Herb had a number of clients in Dallas. And he was really bothered by the fact that it would basically take an entire business day for him to get to Dallas, because it was about a 5-6 hour drive at the time. And then he'd do his meetings the next day, and they have to come back, and it was inefficient for his business plan. So he got together with a group of investors and said, we got to change this. Somehow we got to figure out a way to where we can actually get our business done here in Texas. And so they began to develop sort of a plan for the start of an airline company. The person I'm talking about is Herb Kelleher, the founder of Southwest Airlines. Now, what you don't know is that Herb Kelleher originally was not the founder. He was the legal advisor for the company. He went to a board meeting, and the guy who was the CEO said, my wife tells me I can't do this job. It's too intense, so I'm going to have to step away. And the board in that moment needed to name somebody as the CEO. And as it turned out, Herb Kelleher drew the short straw. And so they named him as the CEO, never intending that he was going to run the company. But because of the articles of incorporation in the state of Texas did not allow for the legal secretary of the corporation to also be the CEO, he had to name somebody as the legal secretary. So he said, oh, I'll get my paralegal. I'll put her name on the certificate. So he decided to name Colleen Barrett. She said, that's the kind of stuff Herb would do all the time. I didn't think much about it. Well, it turns out he sort of got into this whole airline business. And so she said, I just sort of got drug along with him, and we decided we would try and make things happen. Now, Herb is what you would call an angular personality. He's not the kind of person you build a corporate culture around. He's not the kind of person people like or are drawn for. He's like a spectacle, but not somebody that you want to be close with. Colleen, however, is one of these people who's sort of a grandmotherly type. People like her, friendly and warm. And he said, Colleen, you take care of all the soft stuff. I'll do the hard stuff, you do the soft stuff. So she said, all right, no problem. She said, we're going to not have an HR department. We're going to call it the people group. He's like, well, what does that mean? And she said, we're going to treat people like people. We're going to empower our frontline employees. She said, I don't think that we need to be making decisions as managers of do you give somebody a refund or do you book them on another flight? Just tell the ticket manager, the person who's working the desk, solve the customer's problems. And she said, if we solve their problems, I think we'll be profitable. Herb said, you do it, whatever you want to say. Well, what it did is it empowered these frontline employees in a way that nobody else in the airline industry was doing. And suddenly people began to take ownership of their jobs, and it began to build this culture. She said, you know what, we're going to do something that's kind of not aligned with corporate culture. we're going to build a company organizational culture around love. Herb said, what are you talking about, love? He said, we're going to build a culture around profit. She said, no. We're going to actually say that our kind of company is going to love its customers, it's going to love its employees, it's going to love the company that it's built, so much so that that love just sort of overflows, and that's what's going to draw people. We're going to be the countercultural airline. And in order to prove it, we're going to base our operations not here in San Antonio, but we're going to go to Dallas Love Field. And she said, we're going to choose as our corporate trademark a heart. And he said, oh, this is crazy. What are you talking about? She said, no, it's going to work. Well, indeed it did. Built an amazing corporate culture. Southwest Airlines remains to this day the most profitable airline in aviation history. And if you've flown on them, you know, it is an unusual kind of airline. I remember being on a flight where about 30 minutes of the flight, we had an 8-year-old playing the violin on the microphone. Because the flight attendant said, let's have it, let's hear it for our violinist. And I mean, she was terrible, but everybody clapped at the end, and that's what you do, right? It's just sort of a Southwest kind of thing. I go to do the interview with Colleen Barrett at their corporate headquarters in Dallas. And we're sort of making small talk at the end of the interview, and she lets me know that she's in the process of moving. And I said, oh, are you leaving Dallas? She said, no, I'm downsizing. I've been in a big house. I'm moving to a condo. But she said, I can't move just yet. It's another 3 or 4 months. And I said, oh, are you building it? And she said, oh, no, I'm ready to go, but I can't move because I've got a wedding in my backyard. I said, oh, is it one of your family members? And she said, no, actually, I don't know who it is. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, it's a flight attendant. And I said, well, that's kind of unusual. And she said, yeah, one of our flight attendants wrote to me several months ago and said, Colleen, I hear you have a great backyard. Can I have my wedding at your house? And she said, sure, we'd love to have you. And so she said, we got it on the calendar, and I didn't really think about the fact that actually I'd probably be moved out of the house by then, but I can't leave because, she's counting on me, and so we're going to do the wedding. The kind of corporate culture that they have built is such that the CEO stays in their house when they're ready to move because they made a commitment to a flight attendant. Around that same time, there were labor disputes happening with American Airlines and their pilots. Now, American is a rival company. It's actually also based in Dallas at DFW Airport. The Airline Pilots Union took a full-page ad out in the Dallas Morning News, the Houston Chronicle, and New York Times, USA Today, many places. And it was basically a full-page ad that laid out all their grievances with the CEO of the company. It was a public humiliation of the CEO. It's very embarrassing for this guy at American Airlines. 2 days later, the pilots at Southwest Airlines took full-page ads out in the very same publications, but actually used as a chance to say, we love Herb and Colleen. They built the right kind of company. It's one organized around a simple concept. Let's love one another. Colleen has built an amazing corporate culture where you actually understand that love is the heart of what you do, and the way in which we build this company culture that actually makes a profound difference, so much so that employees are willing to take out full-page ads to praise their company leadership. I had a chance to meet some amazing people over the course of my research, but none more impressed me than this guy, Mike Ullman. Mike is the guru of the retail industry. He has had leadership positions in 3 continents: CEO of Macy's, CEO of Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy, the luxury goods conglomerate based in Paris. He invented DFS, duty-free shops, the whole duty-free industry. He was named the CEO of JCPenney not once but twice. And at the time when he took over JCPenney in 2004, they were on the brink of bankruptcy. By the time he retired in 2012, 2 out of 5 American families were doing business with JCPenney every single week. Their customer service scores were higher than that of Nordstrom's. Their employee engagement scores were higher than that of Starbucks. An amazing, amazing story. If you know, he stepped down in 2012. He was replaced by another guy named Ron Johnson, who came in and had a very different sort of understanding of what the business was. The problem is that he alienated all of their existing customers and recruited no new customers. My grandmother shopped at JCPenney for 40 years, but Ron Johnson came in and did away with the coupons. So my grandmother said, I'm not shopping there. I don't have my coupons. Now, what she doesn't realize is that they just changed their price point so that the prices were lower. You didn't need the coupons anymore. But she didn't know that, and so she missed her coupon, so she stopped going. Turns out there are a lot of people like my grandmother. In the course of a single year, they lost $3 billion. Laid off 19,000 employees. They got rid of virtually the top 20 corporate officers of the institution. And it was really in a downward spiral. The board eventually said, we're going to have to make a change, so they encouraged the CEO to step down. And then they're sitting around the boardroom and said, now what are we going to do? Who's going to come and help us rescue this iconic brand that in a year has gone from hero to zero? They finally concluded they had to get Mike to come back. Mike's an amazing guy, and when the board chair called him and said, would you come back? He said, absolutely. I love those people, and my heart is grieved over what's happened. He comes back and had a very significant run in helping to lead the company. He stepped down as the executive chairman a year and a half ago, and it's an amazing story. I went to go interview Mike after he had stepped back into the role, and his secretary, who I'd gotten to know, was walking me back to his office, and I said, does it feel any different now that Mike is back? And she said, oh, it's night and day. And I said, how would you characterize the difference? And she said, well, I know it sounds corny, but with Mike, we just sort of know he loves us, and so we're willing to work extra hard. It's interesting because Mike learned that you have to lead through the pain. If Mike Ullman were here tonight, he could literally not walk from the back of the room to right here. He has a degenerative spinal condition that makes it difficult for him to walk. He relies upon a Segway to get around, and oftentimes, virtually every moment that he's awake, he's feeling some kind of physical pain. But you see, what I learned is that sense of physical pain actually has been able to help Mike connect with people in a very different way. He doesn't come across as a typical slick CEO, but instead as somebody who's real, who makes a real connection with people, inspired deeply out of his Christian faith and a sense that the leader's best job, most important job, is to love his or her people. Scripture tells us that there are 3 virtues that the life of the believer should exhibit. Not rocket science. Faith, hope, and love. Tonight I've told you the stories of 6 individuals who have taken these virtues and built them into the framework of thinking institutionally and acting personally. The story of Horst Schulze, who built an organizational culture where a theological concept, faith, Christian faith, is literally in the very framework that created the Ritz-Carlton corporate identity. The story of Barry Rowan and building an institutional resilience, a sense of hope, even in the midst of a real crisis when the business falls apart in the telecommunications industry in Latin America. And the story of Colleen Barrett, who took the biblical concept of love and said, we're going to make this our organizational mantra, and built it into the institutional identity. But also the story of how Jimmy Carter was able to bring his Christian faith to bear and to take simple concepts like prayer as the glue that built the Camp David Accords and a theological concept of shalom, working at a personal level. Or the story of Condoleezza Rice and how she was able to share her own personal narrative of how a medical technology that allowed her mom to live for 15 years became a personal story that changed the course of human history for millions of kids across Africa. And then Mike Ullman and what he's built at JCPenney, where there's an organizational culture where love is woven into every personal relationship, and people know it. The real opportunity for us in building a legacy of influence is to take simple biblical concepts, faith, hope, and love, and to be able to apply them in our lives, where we think institutionally, but we also act personally. That's how you craft a legacy of influence. Thank you.